So yes, this is a very serious topic, but one that I think we've done a particularly good job here in Florida and in our local jurisdictions here of covering and educating people about. So I'm going to do an overview, and then Brian's going to do an overview about homelessness, and I'll show you during my talk how the two of them can actually be connected, human trafficking and homelessness. So first of all, what I do for a living, I think most of you know this, but the state attorney is the chief prosecutor for the 20th Circuit, which are 5 counties, Lee County here, Collier, Charlotte, Hendry, and Glades. We cover a huge geographical area. It's the biggest in the state. And so we're responsible for prosecuting every single criminal law violation that breaks state law that comes through those 5 counties. By the way, that's about 70,000 cases a year. So we have about 120 assistant state attorneys who serve you prosecuting the cases, and an office of about 300 people. And one of the things we prosecute is human trafficking. Human trafficking, a lot of people don't even realize what it is, but human trafficking is the sale of a human, whether it be for sex or for labor. Those are the 2 most common things we see. And we more frequently see women being sold for sex, men being sold for labor, but it's not exclusive. Sometimes we see men being sold for sex and women being sold for labor. Unfortunately, we do see it here in our jurisdiction, as it's seen, honestly, throughout the entire world, throughout the United States, and then here in Florida. And even though we have the lowest crime rate, remember, 8 years in a row here in the 20th Circuit, those 5 counties, we do see horrific crime. We see horrific murders, we see horrific rapes, and unfortunately, we see human trafficking. So to address this, we actually have specialized prosecutors who work on human trafficking cases. We really have something called the SVU. Have you all seen the SVU on TV? We have that Special Victims Unit. Those attorneys, we have one assigned to every felony judge in the circuit, and they handle the really tough sex crimes, capital sexual battery where a child 11 years or younger has been raped. They handle domestic violence where a felony has occurred and the person has been seriously injured, and they handle the human trafficking cases. People ask me, how many human trafficking cases do you do per year? And I say, that's a darn good question, because it's very difficult to identify a human trafficking victim. And you probably are saying, what do you mean? How can that be difficult? Well, human trafficking, let me explain to you how it normally occurs, or at least what we see here, and then I'll tell you why it's so difficult to identify human trafficking victims and then get the cases the whole way through prosecution. So first of all, Florida, as you may hear over and over again, and I even heard a news story this morning, 3rd highest human trafficking in the United States. Have you all heard that? Florida is number 1. Well, what Florida is number 3, what Florida is really number 3 in is 3rd highest reporting of human trafficking. That's kind of a double-edged sword, right? You could say, well, darn it, we don't want to have all those cases, but on the other hand, people are reporting it, which is very good, which goes back to my first comment about how well we do educate here in Florida and have very tough laws on human trafficking. And every year, our legislative body tries to toughen them by making the education mandatory, by making, for instance, a few years ago, massage parlors hang up signs saying, if you're a victim of human trafficking, call this number. You have to hang those signs up now if you own a massage parlor. So those types of things have been great for education. But here's what we see in human trafficking cases here. The typical human trafficking case, and unfortunately we've prosecuted quite a few of these, is where a person who is already very, very vulnerable. Okay, so this ties in right with what Brian's going to talk about. A homeless person, a runaway. Most instances we've seen here of human trafficking have involved a very vulnerable victim. Either somebody who perhaps is a runaway, somebody who's in a foster care situation, or somebody who's living a very bad home life with mom and dad, sometimes even grandparents. And because they're so traumatized, they become very vulnerable. And guess where they go? Internet. Big provider of human trafficking traffickers who are looking for victims, oftentimes found on the internet. So imagine, and we're seeing a lot of, can be as young as 13 or even younger, up through teenage years, or out on the internet looking for friends. They're lonely, they're traumatized, or it can happen to somebody who's not, which I always say to people, please watch what your children are doing on the internet, on social media. I cannot stress how important that is. It's very, very dangerous out there. So here comes the young woman. It's usually we see young women in this situation looking for friendship. And here comes this hero white knight out of the blue who's suddenly going to become her boyfriend. That's how most human trafficking situations start, with the boyfriend. And the next thing you know, the young woman is holed up in some, well, first she's taken to the movies, and maybe she hasn't gotten to go to the movie, given a cheap piece of jewelry. Nobody's ever given her a piece of jewelry before. And the next thing she knows, she's under this guy's spell. And then the next thing she knows is he's introducing her to drugs. Could start as marijuana, lead on to other things, could just start right out with the opioids, was what it normally ends up as. Addiction to terrible, terrible drugs, usually heroin, and if not heroin, then opioids in the form of pills. And we see this in almost every human trafficking case, which is how the trafficker turns the person who was the girlfriend into the victim of human trafficking. Because the next thing these young women know, they're being sold out of motel rooms, they're being sold out of apartments. And one we busted, and my husband actually ran the human trafficking unit for several years when he was down with the Collier County Sheriff's Office. One of the biggest cases they busted were two women who were being sold out of an apartment for 1 year before one of them got away and went to the sheriff's office. That's what's happening. And before these young women know it, they're no longer a girlfriend. They're a girlfriend of a lot of people, and in a very bad way. So imagine living that lifestyle for several years. And I'll tell you what, the lifespan of a human trafficking victim is only about 7 years, because you cannot sustain the huge amount of drugs and the lack of food and the huge amount of physical violence and sexual violence upon you when you're a human trafficking victim of sex violence. So unfortunately, I'll give you an example, the case down in Naples. Why do we not get so many prosecutions of human trafficking the whole way through the system? A lot of these women, by the time that the police find them, or that somebody turns in the trafficker, or in this particular case in Naples, they actually went to the sheriff's office, they're too traumatized to worry about coming to court. They usually are so addicted to drugs that we spend a year of getting them in and out of rehabs, trying to get them better, and about half the time it works, and about half the time it doesn't, and about half the time it does work, they say, or a doctor says to us, they can't testify. If they testify and face that person in the courtroom, they're never going to be the same again. You can't do that to them. So we're always struggling, how do we do the best for the community and make sure the trafficker gets punished, balanced against the rights and what we need to do to hopefully move the victim on with their life, because it's terrible, terrible trauma. This is probably the place we see some of the most trauma of victims. And the case in Collier County is a great example, because these two women were holed up in an apartment being sold. The one who got away one day and ran to the sheriff's office came up to the front desk and said that she was the victim of a rape. She did not say she was the victim of a human trafficking. She said, I was raped by somebody I know, and he's over in this apartment. Well, they brought a detective, and the detective actually worked for Mike's unit, and they were trained on recognizing human trafficking, which loops me back to my first point. We don't always know that it's human trafficking. In this case, she reported it as a rape of her. We had no idea she was being sold. The detective had been trained and educated, because we do a really good job of that here, and he went, this is a human trafficking victim. Let's go get a search warrant for this apartment. And guess what was in the apartment? Another victim and a ledger, which showed how much money these horrendous individuals had made over the course of the year on these two women. And it was a lot of money. It was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is why human trafficking has become almost as profitable an illicit business as the narcotics trade. Imagine that. The sale of humans has become almost as profitable. So that first victim was a cooperative witness. She was terribly addicted to heroin. We got her through rehab. She made it all the way through to the day of trial. The other victim did not make it through to the day of trial. She was extremely uncooperative. She'd been very, very traumatized. She was very strung out, and she wanted nothing to do with us. She didn't want anything to do with the sheriff's office. She didn't want anything to do with the state attorney's office. And despite all our best efforts, we didn't end up in getting that count of human trafficking through to trial. But we knew she was a human trafficking victim. So lesson learned, very important, was we see a lot of prostitution cases where the woman, let's say woman, I know I'm using that all the time, but that's what we see more frequently here. The woman is busted for prostitution. Well, back in the old days, I first became a prosecutor in the 90s, we would have never thought twice about, well, wait a minute, what are we really seeing here? Now we're all trained, we have mandatory education, and we would do it anyway in our office, even if it wasn't mandatory. Our prosecutors and all our law enforcement are trained to say, maybe that's not a prostitution case, maybe she's being sold by somebody as part of a human trafficking ring, and oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes that's what it is. So those are human trafficking cases that maybe aren't being prosecuted that way, but we're recognizing that as a victim. Drug busts. We get a lot of narcotics busts where people are caught with heroin, and we realize, well, this person's addicted to heroin because they're a human trafficking victim in that spiral of what human traffickers do to their victims. So we've started in our circuit so that we can try to address, well, how many of these cases do we really have that we haven't even been able to prosecute because of the dynamics and the trauma? And so a couple years ago, I started something called HT Counts, which is a play on the word counts, but it stands for Human Trafficking Counts. And counts means to count numbers, and of course it counts. It's important. So we started a couple years ago getting statistics from we started with the Collier Sheriff and a couple of agencies here, Catholic Charities, our Shelter for Abused Women, and our ACT shelter here, and said, send us any numbers of victims you're seeing that even if there's not a human trafficking charged, you can tell they're a victim of it, whether you can tell it through drug abuse, what they're telling you privately that they don't want to tell a law enforcement or prosecutor. So we've been able now to start counting how many of these are we really seeing, how many victims do we really have, and what do we need to do for them? What services can we provide? And so this has been so successful that we just recently, and unfortunately COVID hit right when we did it, but we kicked off to the entire 5 counties. All 5 sheriffs came on board to count data. Our police chiefs came on board. So I'm hoping once we get through this period that we'll get all the data back, and I'm really hoping by the end of this year to have a report, our first big report from HT Counts. But I can tell you this, a lot of our human trafficking victims are runaways in this circuit. And a lot of our human trafficking victims were homeless before they became a human trafficking victim. Again, vulnerable people. So I think what Brian is going to talk about, and of course our county commission, Brian and Cecil, thank you. They are always tremendously supportive of our office's efforts in any area like this, and always extremely helpful. They actually help us fund specialized positions that do our diversionary, our problem-solving courts, like our drug court, where a lot of these young women or men end up, so that we can try to help them with their drug problem instead of just throwing them in, instead of just incarcerating them. Because once we can get them better, they can come testify. So thank you to both of you for that. And I'll kick it over to Brian, then Brian and I are going to take some questions about anything you want to talk about and the intersection between our 2 subjects.
Thank you. Can we hear for Amira? Amira, we are so blessed to have you here serving as our state attorney, and we're just, thank you very much. You know, before I jump into homelessness as a topic, I do want to share something that Commissioner Pendergrass supported. I brought forward an ordinance that Amira talked about with the signage that has to go up in every dance club and every massage parlor in the area in Lee County now. They have to put up a sign with the human trafficking hotline on it. We brought that forward. It was something that came through the state legislature, and I want to thank Commissioner Pendergrass for supporting that as well. Well, tonight I want to talk to you about homelessness. I think all of us have noticed the uptick in people panhandling at our intersections. I think we've seen the stories on the news. We've seen the tents pop up in the parks, and we want to know what's going on. The point that I want you all to go home with tonight is that Lee County is expanding our services to help those who are experiencing homelessness, and we're working to help them get back on their feet and into housing. Right now, the way to think about homelessness is this. It's a community issue. The government certainly has a role in helping with homelessness, but so do individuals, so do charities, so do churches. But tonight I'll focus on the things that Lee County is doing so that you can understand a little bit about what our role is in solving the problem. So in Lee County, we're helping people who are having a hard time get back on their feet by operating under the philosophy of we want homeless to be rare, we want it to be brief, and we want it to be one time. The most important thing that we're doing, last year, by the way, we spent $11.3 million of federal, state, and county tax money to try and support these homelessness programs to help people out. The things we're doing to make it rare are basically things related to prevention. If you can actually stop somebody from becoming homeless, that's the biggest win. And I want you to know that for every tent that you see go up or every person you see standing at a stoplight, that there are dozens, probably hundreds more that we've prevented from going homeless through the programs that you all support with your tax dollars, the housing assistance, the mortgage and rental assistance that we provide. We also provide assistance to help people keep the lights on at their homes through electric bills and through utility bills as well. We also provide food assistance as well. One of the things we've done through COVID-19 is you've seen a lot of food pantries and a lot of food banks pop up with these mobile food banks. We gave a significant amount to the tune of several $1 million to local food banks to help make sure that we fed people who were falling on hard times because they had lost their incomes with COVID-19. We want to make homelessness brief. The biggest way that we try to help people who become homeless is to get them back into some sort of housing as soon as possible. To do that, we've set up a 211 line in coordination with the United Way. We call it the Coordinated Entry Line. So this is a one-stop line with a trained specialist who, if you dial 211 and you're experiencing homelessness, they can direct you to the right services that can help you out. You know, a lot of times it's very frustrating for somebody who may be experiencing homelessness to go to just a nonprofit agency that they heard may help them and find out that they don't qualify for those specific services. We want to help streamline that for them so that their homelessness is as brief as possible and get them into programs. And the big reason why is because the longer a person's homeless, the harder it is to actually get them back into housing and back into accepting help. And I'll tell you about a story. I went out earlier this week with our homeless outreach team to do what they call the point in time count. It's basically a one day where we go out and try to take a census of people who are homeless in our area. I want to tell you a story about that in just a little bit. But basically the goal of the brief part is call 211, let us do the work for you. Don't just go to a shelter. We want to get you to the right services. The other thing that we do is called rapid rehousing. So we actually have relationships with landlords that are willing to accept folks who are experiencing homelessness. We will cover the rent for a certain period of time, and then as the person gets on their feet, then they begin to take over that responsibility. Our rapid rehousing program in Lee County actually has more than 200 beds annually. And those 200 beds are helping a lot of people, a lot of families. But honestly, we could use absolutely more here in Lee County, and that's something the commissioners have focused on. And then finally, we talked about rare, we talked about brief, we want to talk about one time. So, you know, when somebody enters any of our programs, it's not like we just give them a shelter to sleep in and a roof and a meal for the night. We want to know that person's story. We want to know how they ended up in the position where they're at. You know, a lot of times it could be a lost job. Sometimes it could be domestic violence. You know, it could be any number of things. There are actually dozens of nonprofit programs out there that cater to all of these individuals' specific needs. Some of those we call wraparound services. What we've tried to do is take the approach of putting all the nonprofits under the same roof where the people are finding shelter, so that while people are there getting shelter and their basic needs met, they can talk to a counselor, they can talk to somebody about their story, and they can figure out what's available to help them get back on their feet. So these are things like job training and job searching, financial literacy and budgeting, Social Security applications. Believe it or not, a lot of people who are homeless actually qualify for an income. They've earned throughout their lives, a living and actually paid into the system, and are, especially many veterans, are actually due an income that they don't get connected to until they actually get to the shelter and connect with our folks. We also offer behavioral health services, transportation, child care, life skills, case management. That's what the wraparound services is all about. It's not about just giving somebody a roof over their head for one night. It's about learning their story and taking them through all the way to the other side and getting them back up on their feet. And so, finally, again, I want to tell you this story. We work so hard to help people out and get them rehoused as quickly as possible, because the other day I went out and we spoke with a gentleman during the point in time count. I went to Hancock and 41. There's that big abandoned plaza that we all drive by. Behind there's probably about a dozen tents. People are living behind there in their tents. One gentleman we talked with had been homeless for a couple years, and at that point it was really hard to get him to come talk to us, to get him to accept any services. When we encountered him, he had a smartphone, he had a tent with a roof over his head, he had plenty of blankets. People bring him food all the time. He gets breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And he's got a smartphone. He has the ability to charge his phone. And so he wasn't interested in going to any of the shelters. In fact, he had tried them in the past and they just didn't fit. What we find is a lot of folks, they're dealing with some really hard stuff. Substance abuse, maybe even mental health issues. And it's hard to convince that person to come to a shelter where you can't drink for the night. You can't drink while you're at the shelter, or you can't have, one of them said to us, we talked to multiple people, one of them said to us, I can't go there because I can't live on only 4 cigarettes a day. So they would refuse to go and get the help because they wanted to live by the rules that they were used to on the streets. And the longer that goes, that somebody's on the streets, then the more they get used to living their lifestyle. And the harder it is to get them back. So that's, again, one of the reasons why we've been focusing so much on trying to get people rehoused and make this as brief as possible. And so with that, I'd love to answer any questions you have. Obviously, I talked about the $11.3 million that we spent last year. Throughout COVID-19, we've spent $54 million of the CARES federal money that they sent to us in rent, mortgage, and utility assistance. Think about that. $54 million has helped families and tried to prevent them from going homeless in Lee County so that they're not facing those situations. Those are the stories you don't really see on the news, but they're good stories that you can feel good about that we're working towards in Lee County. What questions do y'all have about human trafficking or homelessness or anything?
Michelle.
Amira, this question is for you about human trafficking. I was just curious if you get any cases with children.
Yes, very unfortunately we get cases with children. And just before I answer that, I want to say it just was so interesting to me what Brian just said, because we see the same thing with somebody who's homeless and doesn't want to go to the shelter, has become so used to whatever is going wrong in their life. They can't get off the alcohol, they can't get off the drugs, so they can't go to the shelter. That's what we see with human trafficking. They can't conceive of getting off the drugs, which they have to, as they step into the criminal justice system. So it's so interesting to me how they really do intersect. Child crimes are particularly heartbreaking. We see children human trafficked at a very young age, unfortunately. Now remember, if you're 11 years of age or younger, that's a capital sexual battery. So if somebody has sex with you, so everyone always says to me, well, why don't the Johns get charged? How come the people who are buying the sex don't get charged? And in Florida, as well as in most states, the charge is a misdemeanor for the person who buys the sex, unless they are the person responsible for selling out the human, in which case they face life in prison. But remember, if it's the John on the street who gets busted in a prostitution, let's say Cape Coral PD is doing a prostitution sting, and they're not responsible for being the person who put the woman out there to sell them, but they're buying her, that's a misdemeanor unless it's child. Remember, there is no consensual sex with children. If there's a child 11 years of age or younger and there's a capital sexual battery, it is mandatory life in prison for a conviction. So anyone with a child like that, and we've just had, unfortunately, several that we put in the system today for people who feel the need to do that to a child who's 11 or younger. And then, of course, children all up through different ages, up to the age of 16, there's charges that they can't consent, and even some for 18, depending on how old, or under 18, depending on how old the other party is. So those all carry very, very serious prison terms. So even if we can't bust the human trafficking element of it, and remember, there's a difference between, and this is what really confuses people. What do you mean? I mean, isn't every prostitution a human trafficking? No. There might be some people, and we've seen many, successful escort services, and the person who's selling themselves is a willing participant. That's how they make a living. That's a lot different than somebody who's being coerced or forced to sell themselves, and somebody else is getting the money, and that's the difference. Human trafficking is the coercion or forcing of somebody to sell themselves for sex. So there is a difference there, but child cases, I'm happy to say we have another way of tackling those, and very, very strong laws for those. So that's a great thing.
I think collectively here we probably all felt the same. 11 seems like a very low bar. Why isn't that bar higher, like at 15 or 16?
Well, now, 11 is for the mandatory life in prison with no chance of parole. But if, let's say you have sex with somebody who's 12, 13, 14, 15, the laws change as you hit the 16-year mark, and it's not as many years in prison, but it still could carry 30 or even sometimes 40 years in prison depending on the circumstances.
Okay.
So it's, I get it, but yes, it's they're always a pretty strict prison sentence for those. I want to say, because I forgot to say this, but I think you'll find this interesting. So guess what's about to happen this weekend in Tampa? Guess what happens when the Super Bowl comes to town, even though it's going to be much less attended than other years. But I'm a member of the statewide council against human trafficking that our Attorney General Ashley Moody runs. And she puts one state attorney in Florida on the council, and I was very honored she selected me. And so the thing we've been working on is the Super Bowl. And guess that goes right back to what Brian was talking about, which is when there's homeless people in a town where you're about to get a big thing like the Super Bowl, and you're about to get tremendous demand for sex, honestly. There has been our goal has been, well, let's educate. So there's billboards all over Tampa. The sides of buses have warnings, and the sheriff in Tampa just did a massive sting. You may have seen it on the news. He did a prostitution sting and arrested 101 people and sent the message, you come here to buy sex, guess what's going to happen to you? So that's been really rewarding, taking part in that. That's been really great.
Yes.
I've witnessed a situation, one in particular, whereby a panhandler was at Walgreens and with a sign sitting outside Walgreens, and then a certain amount of time went by and a vehicle came up, and the panhandler went to the vehicle, went to the vehicle, gave the person in the vehicle money, the vehicle went away. So what I would call that is a drug pimp, personally. I don't know what you guys call it. But it's, in other words, it's someone who's panhandling so that they can pay off their drug debt or someone else for protection or something. There's a reason why that gentleman went to that vehicle to give money. And they came back and sat down and put the sign up that he needed money. So is there any type of a law or recourse for that type of situation when we see it, when we personally see that in other words, what's kind of infuriating me is I always give to people who have a sign up, but I'm getting had.
That's such a tough question, because we all know that we see certain people who are panhandling or begging on the side of the road, and I think a lot of us, because of the type of people we are, feel pretty heartbroken, and so we feel like, well, gosh, I'd really like to help them out. The problem is that a lot of times the money you're giving, I think the dynamic has changed a little bit in the last year. You're seeing more families out there addressing, and this goes again back to what Brian was talking about, but sometimes all you are doing is feeding a drug debt or a drug habit. And is there anybody you can call? I happen to know that Sheriff Marcino I was traveling somewhere with him on the road, and they were trying to stop vehicles. And so, yes, there's certain things they do where they're being obstructive. And, you know, he basically told them, if I have to tell you again, because he'd already seen them once that day, I'm going to have to come back and arrest you. And then he would, you know, we would all try to see if there was any treatment the person needed to get them off the street and to work with the county. But your question is actually a very sophisticated question because it's so multi-layered. And yes, there's certain things they're doing that are against the law, but they're not exactly things that the sheriff's office wants to go and take everybody off the street and put them in jail for. They're really trying to solve the issue, working with our county commission. It's in us, because we try to do diversionary programs where we try to take someone like that and say, okay, what do we need to do to get you better so you're not out in the middle of the street paying off drug debt? What drug court do you need? What mental health court? What veterans treatment court do you need? We have all of those. So we try very hard to address that, you know, instead of putting a Band-Aid, we try to address the root. But boy, it's tough some days, especially now we are seeing a new homeless population that we haven't seen before. It isn't so much maybe the drug problems, it's losing a job.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll share with you another thing. When I was out with the homeless outreach team the other day doing the point in time count, one of the things that they told me, you know, I asked, well, why don't we go out there and talk to the panhandler? And the person who was with me, his experience is that the majority of the panhandlers he's run into are not homeless. They have a place to stay, and they won't accept the services anyways because they're actually making enough money from the panhandling to support their lifestyle on the street, that lifestyle that they've gotten used to now. So, you know, it's hard, but it's almost like we're conservatives. We believe in the market, right? Well, the market has actually met their needs by providing an income for them through their panhandling, which is really, when you think about it, become their job. They show up at the same corner every day to ask for money, and they make the money. And it's really hard. The hard thing about that is it makes it harder now for that person to come and accept the services that might actually help them get up on their feet and out of that lifestyle and into, you know, permanent housing and a permanent solution for them. One of the things the county commissioners did the other day, we cut the ribbon on the Salvation Army's Homeless Day Center. This is an exciting facility. So in this facility, a homeless person can come and get a shower, get a shave, get a meal, cup of coffee, charge their phone. But inside of that facility, we also have all of those wraparound services that I've talked about. And so one of the early stories that we got was a person went there, said, I got my first shower in weeks, I'm shaved, I was able to do my laundry. We have different laundry facilities set up there. I was able to do my laundry. I've got clean clothes on, again, for the first time in a long time. I feel like a new person. And they were willing to then talk. Yeah. That's exciting. So I'm hoping that we can actually do maybe a couple more of those throughout the county, because I think that might be our gateway to get people to permanent housing. Yes.
That also kind of dovetails into my next question would be that, okay, so I see someone, I want to give them some help besides monetary help. Where do I go to find out what you have available that I can inform them of? Because they probably just got down here from, you know, Alabama or Ohio or somewhere else because it's warm.
The easiest thing that I can tell you, the easiest thing for you to remember is 211. That's the coordinated entry line. It's through the United Way, 211. The person who will answer the phone at 211 will be able to listen to the person's story and then get them directed to the right place to go. And then, you know, if you want to find out more about what our resources are, of course, we've got legov.com. Under our Human and Veteran Services page, we actually lay out a 10-year strategic plan to address homelessness. You know, it's very aspirational, but it's also something that is being worked on genuinely in earnest by our county staff all the time. Yeah. Yes?
I go on Saturdays and I help feed the homeless. I take clothes. Last week my husband and I bought a homeless man a bicycle. So I'm involved in that. Mm-hmm. And I've just moved down here within the past year. And I've noticed just in the past 2 months, the homeless population has really risen. I go up to the Walmart and to Lions Park. How many people are actually employed full-time on your HOT team?
That's a good question. It's a partnership between Lee County Human and Veteran Services, the Sheriff's Office, and then we also even bring along with us a mental health counselor as well. I can't give you that number off the top of my head, but I know we do have multiple teams throughout the county whose job it is to really proactively approach these folks and talk to them. And they've got to build a rapport, you know, especially with the chronically homeless, to get them to take it. That's a good question.
Well, I actually believe that a lot of the homeless down here don't really want the help that's being offered. They love that we're bringing them food and clothes, and it's a need they need. I mean, they need these things.
Sure.
But they don't want to go further. They don't want to take the steps. They enjoy us bringing them to them.
Yeah, the comment was that a lot of the homeless are so comfortable, if you will, with the services or the people who brought them bikes and clothes and food, you know, that they don't want to take that next step to get towards the permanent housing. And I can tell you just from what I witnessed the other day, that really does seem to be a massive challenge we've got to address. But the good thing is that 211 line that I talk about, and the rapid rehousing that I talk about, and the utilities and the rent and the mortgage assistance that I talk about, that's helping, you know, the mom and dad who maybe have lost their job during COVID and have kids at home and now they can't pay the bills. If they call that 211 before they ever become homeless or face eviction or anything like that, or foreclosure, we can get them help to prevent them from ever becoming that, and hopefully not even start that cycle.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, if anything happened to myself or anybody here, I have never heard of 211 until tonight. Never have I heard that. My first thought would be 911. So
Yeah.
what efforts are being made to get that advertising out there? That 211
Live here on Facebook, loaded up on YouTube, and there will be a slate with it from our club. So that's one thing.
211 used to be something totally different years ago, right?
Well,
It wasn't Orlando.
Yeah, it's a United Way hotline
It's
that
United Way, that it used to be recorded answering.
right.
It was recorded.
We've recently revamped it, though. It is staffed 24 hours a day. That's my understanding, with somebody who's ready to take the call now. So yeah, don't think 911, think 211 for homeless issues. But 911 should be able to help refer them as well, Mike. I mean, that's probably a coordination there. Hey, let me go in the back and then up to Bob.
I have a question for Amira. As a mother, I have 4 girls. I'm not as, I should say I'm not as concerned about the internet drawing out of the house. Of course, it's a concern, but my biggest concern is the snatch and grab that you see on TV, that you read about. I mean, my biggest concern is my kids are playing in the street and next thing you know, how much do you account for that in our area?
So I'm very happy to tell you that it's very little. The human trafficking cases we see are very much so the let me make this person my friend, my girlfriend, let me entice them with drugs. And of course that's awful also, but we do not see the kidnapping, that's kidnapping, where someone's kidnapped to be sold. The only place we see that a little bit in our jurisdiction, I'm not saying you don't see it in other places, I think you see it pretty frequently in places like Miami, but I'm very grateful we don't see that here. We do see some parent abductions, but it's not unfortunately we saw a grandparent abduction where they took the child and then sold the child, but they took the child to Miami. I mean, it's just unbelievable some of the stuff we see. But we are not seeing so much the stranger abduction where the child is sold for sex. Unfortunately, what we do see sometimes, and it's heartbreaking, is the stranger, because you have to be so careful. Everyone has to be careful, especially if you're children. We do see stranger abductions where, the children are kidnapped and they're killed. Unfortunately, we've had some of those in this jurisdiction, and those are just, I don't even know what to say about those. They're so horrific. So yes, we're very fortunate that we have a much lower level of violent crime than anywhere else in the state, but we still have it. So just vigilance. When we were pulling out of our house tonight, there were 2 children running around who the parents, I think, never let out of the house. I was like, why don't those parents let their kids out of the house? Well, tonight they were running around without a parent in sight, and they even said, I really feel like this is unusual. But then we saw them going towards the house and they went into their yard. But otherwise, I mean, we would have gone and said, what's going on, kids? Why are you out of the house? You're not usually running around the neighborhood like this without your parents. So it's, you know, I think all of us have to just be very aware and very aware of social media. It's not a good thing for kids. Yes.
This is more a comment than a question, but the state legislature has done a good thing. They have required that every physician in the state of Florida for relicensure must do an hour or two. Is it 1 or 2 hours?
I think it's one. I think you were right, yeah.
Of human trafficking.
Yes, and we have that as prosecutors, and judges have to do it manually. We have to do human trafficking education and training so that we're all aware, and doctors, medical, so important because they're seeing these victims in their lobbies. I have a case where a doctor heard one of my speeches and then said, I saw them again a couple months later, and they said, oh my God, what you said, we started looking for in our lobby, and we had a woman sitting there with a man. She was emaciated, she looked so ill. He was saying that she had just hurt herself, and we could see she wouldn't meet his eyes. She wouldn't let him, she wouldn't meet anybody's eyes, and then he was talking for her. Guess what? They had heard me speak somewhere, actually in front of the our medical society here in Lee County, and they called me a couple weeks later and said, we called 911, and he was caught in the parking lot with her. So amazing, and the medical thing is so important, and Therese, the hospital, and Therese is on our hospital board, of course, they've been wonderful in the education and making sure our community knows what the heck can go on out there so that we can all recognize it and do something about it, hopefully.
Yeah, Brian, I'm just curious, as the homeless issue appears to be escalating, speaking of speed, we all saw on TV, we all go back, LA, San Francisco, etc., where it starts out at one level and then continues to grow, the problem's never solved, and we become these cities of tents and then drug paraphernalia. It worsens and worsens. Obviously, we're spending a lot of resources to try and stop it.
Right.
What is the success rate? Where are we at today? What are you experiencing in terms of helping reduce it, slow it down, stop it, what have you?
Sure. Well, the success rate is definitely a lot better the earlier on that you can get to people and get them services and help. What we're seeing right now, the uptick even currently, believe it or not, according to the human services folks that I talked with the other day, is also partly seasonal. We're warm. It's actually a more pleasant experience to be outside here right now during this time of year than it would be to be up north. And we even do it as well, a lot of human and veteran services organizations throughout different parts of the United States will give bus passes. You know, if we speak to a homeless person who can tell us that they have family in a specific town up north and a specific place to stay up north as opposed to sleeping on the streets here, we'll help provide them transport to that area. Now, so that may be how some folks are making it down here as well. They also could be panhandling to make the money to get down here as well. But yeah, we do see a certain element of that. So if tradition holds, we'll see the homeless population actually lean out again once the weather changes up north. But we need to, like you said, continue to work with the problem. I'm very concerned about what we're seeing in the parks. Now, because the parks are public facilities, to kick somebody out of a park during daylight hours is actually a civil rights deal. It's hard. It's a very hard thing to prosecute. And then even really to deal with it overnight is a tough call for any law enforcement out there. We support our law enforcement. We don't want to put them in any dangerous situations, but this is something that I'm concerned about. It's something that's got the attention of myself and the sheriff's office, and I know Amira's even paying attention to it. And rest assured, we're going through all the different scenarios of what we can do to try and make sure this doesn't become the problem that we see out in the West. And by the way, what you're seeing on the West Coast is really interesting. Not only are you seeing the homeless problems on the West Coast, you're seeing some groups out there actually capitalize on that and become homeless advocates out there. They have recently led protests out on the West Coast where they've gone in and occupied their local city halls and then taken over the city halls. And we've seen this in some of the Washington and Oregon cities. Well, thank God we didn't see anything today, but there was actually scheduled at Lee County an Occupy Lee County protest. It was on Facebook. We saw it on social media. Thank goodness they didn't show up and it didn't happen because we didn't need that kind of a confrontation. I think everybody should know that we could work together. The community is taking this very seriously and trying to help people get back on their feet.
I just had a comment. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and I've been here 4 years. But I have to tell you, and it's not to knock Floridians at all, but there's such a stigma here, in my opinion, of the way that people view homeless people and treat homeless people. It's very sad. I would love to see more involvement on helping people to understand homeless people. You know, everybody sort of just has this idea that if you're homeless, you're lazy. I mean, I've seen people literally scream at homeless people like, "Go get a job!" And a guy's standing there, you know, in like, 3-week-old clothes with little garbage bags all around his bicycle, and just emaciated. But it's heartless. It's heartless. I really, really believe that people need to understand homeless people more and have a little more respect. Because I think that, you know, when you give respect to others, that encourages them to want to respect themselves. But I think when people are continuously barraging homeless people or making fun out of them, I even saw a guy spat on a guy. Okay, and I tried to pick up and call the police for that.
The point is well taken. You know, compassion for other human beings goes a long way. And I mean, we think about the atrocities that Amira talked about tonight, and the fact that human beings can sell other human beings and treat other human beings that way. It's horrific. It's disgusting. It's an atrocity. It's one of the greatest atrocities of our time, I believe. And I'm glad that there are strong people out there who are fighting it. And who are doing a good job for us. And I agree. You know, that's why we created the homeless outreach teams, and that's why it wasn't just sending a law enforcement officer out there by themselves to encounter the homeless person. We understand that maybe that might be intimidating. So they actually dress differently out of uniform. They bring a counselor with them as well. And so it's an effort to try and do what you're saying, approach it from a more compassionate standpoint, to learn their story, and then still make the sales pitch, if you will, to get them to come and get the help that we know they need. So,
can we get a round of applause for our speakers?
If you're live on Facebook, this will be uploaded later this week as a hard copy with all the contact information. Should you?
I have a 6-year-old
Thank you
at
for
home
joining us.
who I need to get home to, so I'm going to pass the microphone over to our lovely Marty, who has agreed to pick